My wedding day finally arrived, and I was beaming. Everything seemed perfect: the venue, the decorations, my dress. I couldn't wait to marry the love of my life. Little did I know, however, that an unexpected event was about to turn the whole celebration upside down. My name is Amelie, and that day I woke up with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. The sun was filtering through the curtains of my hotel room, promising a radiant day. I stood up, heart pounding, and glanced at my wedding dress hanging on the closet door. It was a bespoke creation in lace and silk that had cost me a small fortune, but was worth every penny. My best friend and maid of honor, Sophie, entered the room with a breakfast tray and a big smile. "So, future Madame Dupont, ready for the big day?" she asked as she placed the tray on the table. I took a deep breath. "As ready as I can be," I replied, trying to calm the butterflies in my stomach. The morning flew by. Between hair, makeup, and dressing, I didn't see the time go by. My parents came to see me just before I left for church. My mother had tears in her eyes as she hugged me. "You're beautiful, my darling," she whispered. "Nicholas is a lucky man." My father, usually so stoic, seemed moved too. He took my hand and squeezed it gently. "Are you ready?" he asked. I nodded, unable to speak as the emotion overwhelmed me. The drive to the church was like a dream. The streets of Paris flashed before my eyes, but I couldn't really see them, too busy imagining the moment when I would see Nicholas waiting for me at the end of the aisle. When we arrived, my heart raced. The church was magnificent, decorated with white flowers and silk ribbons. Guests turned as I passed, murmuring compliments I could barely hear. And then I saw him. Nicholas, my Nicholas, standing at the altar, more handsome than ever in his bespoke suit. Our eyes met and I knew, at that very moment, that I had made the right choice. The ceremony unfolded like a fairy tale. We exchanged our vows, our wedding rings, and finally, that kiss that sealed our union. As we turned back to the congregation, hand in hand, I thought my heart would burst with happiness. As we left the church, we were greeted by a shower of rose petals and cheers from our loved ones. It was a magical moment, perfect in every way. The drive to the reception hall was filled with laughter and stolen kisses. Nicholas kept telling me how beautiful I was, how much he loved me. I was on cloud nine. The reception hall was a dream come true. The tables were elegantly set, adorned with sumptuous floral centerpieces. A huge multi-tiered cake sat in the corner, patiently waiting for us to cut it together. Little by little, our guests arrived, congratulating and embracing us. I shook so many hands, received so many hugs that I felt dizzy. But it was a pleasant, intoxicating dizziness. However, in the midst of all this joy, I noticed something strange. Nicholas's mother, Madame Leclerc, seemed different. She had always been an imposing woman, but that evening, there was something in her gaze that made me uneasy. I tried not to pay attention, telling myself it was probably the emotion of the moment. Dinner began, and everything seemed to be going swimmingly. The food was delicious, the wine flowed freely, and conversations were lively. Nicholas and I moved from table to table, taking the time to chat with each of our guests. As the evening progressed and the dance floor began to fill up, I felt overwhelmed by a wave of happiness. I looked around at all the people we loved, gathered to celebrate our love. It was just perfect. Nicholas took me by the hand and led me onto the dance floor for our first dance as husband and wife. As we twirled to a gentle melody, I met Madame Leclerc's gaze. She was watching us with an expression I couldn't make out. Was it disapproval? Was it anger? I quickly looked away, not wanting to let the thought spoil this magical moment. The evening was in full swing, and I felt like a princess in a fairy tale. Nothing seemed to be able to tarnish this perfect happiness. At least, that's what I thought at the time. If only I'd known what was going to happen. If only I could have foreseen the storm that was brewing, ready to erupt at the heart of our celebration. But I was too happy, too intoxicated by love and joy, to see the warning signs. This day, which had started out as the happiest day of my life, was about to take a turn I could never have imagined. And all because of one person, my mother-in-law, Madame Leclerc. During the reception, I noticed that my mother-in-law, Madame Leclerc, was behaving strangely. She was drinking more than usual and giving me hostile looks. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the stress of the moment, but I was wrong. The evening was in full swing, and I was trying to enjoy every moment of what was to be the happiest day of my life. However, I couldn't help noticing Madame Leclerc's increasingly erratic behavior. At first, I tried to convince myself it was nothing. After all, weddings can be stressful for everyone, can't they? But as the hours passed, it became harder and harder to ignore her actions. The first thing I noticed was her frequent trips to the bar. Each time she returned, her glass was full to the brim. It wasn't unusual to drink at a wedding, of course, but the frequency with which she emptied her glass was alarming. "Have you seen your mother?" I quietly asked Nicholas as we danced. He glanced over my shoulder and shrugged. "She's just having fun. Don't worry." But I couldn't help worrying. Every time our eyes met, I saw a gleam in his eyes that chilled my blood. It was a mixture of contempt and something else, malice, perhaps. I tried to focus on the positive aspects of the evening. The music was excellent, the food delicious, and our guests seemed to be having a good time. But despite my best efforts, I couldn't completely ignore my mother-in-law's menacing presence. At one point, I apologized to Nicholas and went to the bathroom to freshen up. On my way out, I came face to face with Madame Leclerc. "Oh, Madame Leclerc," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Are you having a nice evening?" She looked me up and down, her eyes slightly glassy from the alcohol. "A good evening," she sneered. How could I have a good evening watching my son ruin his life? I was taken aback by his blunt reply. I don't understand," I stammered. "Of course you don't understand," she spat. "You're too busy playing princess to see how inadequate you are for my Nicholas." Before I could reply, she staggered off, leaving me speechless in the hallway. I returned to the reception room, shaken by the encounter. I looked around for Nicholas, needing his reassuring presence. He was laughing with his friends, oblivious to the drama unfolding. Sophie, my maid of honor, must have noticed my confusion because she approached me. "Are you all right, Amélie? You look pale." I hesitated for a moment before telling her what had just happened. She listened attentively, her face changing from surprise to anger. "That old hag," she exclaimed. "Don't let her spoil your day, Amélie. This is your wedding, your moment." I nodded, grateful for his support. "You're right. I'm not going to let her ruin this for me." But that was easier said than done. For the rest of the evening, I couldn't help glancing nervously at Madame Leclerc. She kept drinking, more and more, and her behavior became more and more erratic. At one point, I saw her trip and spill her drink on a guest's dress. Instead of apologizing, she laughed loudly, drawing the attention of several people around her. Nicholas finally noticed that something was wrong. He approached me, concern visible on his face. "Amélie, what's going on? You seem preoccupied." I hesitated. I didn't want to spoil her happiness by telling her about her mother's behavior. But at the same time, I knew I couldn't keep it to myself. "It's your mother," I finally confessed. "She's been acting strangely. She drinks a lot and she said some hurtful things to me." Nicholas's face darkened. What? What did she say to you?" I repeated his mother's cruel words, seeing the anger rise in him as I spoke. "I'm sorry, Amélie," he said, taking me in his arms. "I'll talk to her." "No, please," I begged. "Don't make a scene. This is our wedding, I don't want it to turn into a family drama." Nicholas hesitated, but finally acquiesced. "All right, but if she continues, I'll have to intervene." We tried to get on with the evening, dancing and laughing with our guests. But the shadow of Madame Leclerc still hung over us. As the evening wore on, her behavior became increasingly unpredictable. She started talking loudly, interrupting conversations, making inappropriate comments. Several guests began to notice, casting embarrassed glances in her direction. I saw Nicholas' father try to calm her down, but she pushed him away violently. "Leave me alone," she shouted, drawing the attention of the whole room. Silence fell for a moment, all eyes riveted on Madame Leclerc. Then, slowly, conversations resumed, but the atmosphere had changed. There was a tension in the air, as if everyone was waiting for something to explode. I tried to keep calm, to concentrate on the positive aspects of the evening. But it was getting harder and harder. Every time I saw Madame Leclerc, my heart clenched with apprehension. Nicolas did his best to entertain me, leading me in wild dances, introducing me to family members I hadn't yet met. But even in these moments of joy, I couldn't help glancing nervously at my mother-in-law. At one point, as we stood on the dance floor, I saw Madame Leclerc staggering towards us. My heart began to race. What was she going to do? What was she going to say? But before she could reach us, Sophie intervened, deftly intercepting her and dragging her towards the buffet. I gave my friend a grateful look, and she winked at me discreetly. I knew, however, that this was only the beginning. Madame Leclerc seemed determined to do something, to say something. And the longer the evening went on, the more I dreaded this moment. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was just stress and alcohol making her act that way. Maybe everything was going to be all right. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I could feel that something was about to happen. Something that would change the course of this evening, and maybe even the course of our lives. And I was right. Because what was going to happen next was going to exceed my worst fears. Suddenly, in the middle of the dance floor, Madame Leclerc called out to me. All the guests turned to look. With a mischievous smile, she said, "Serve me like a slave or the wedding's over." The room fell into absolute silence. My heart raced. Time seemed to stand still. The eyes of all the guests were riveted on me, waiting for my reaction. I could feel the tension rising in the room, as if the air itself had become thick and heavy. Madame Leclerc stood there, in the center of the dance floor, her glass in her hand, a wry smile on her lips. She looked almost triumphant, as if she'd been waiting for this moment all evening. Maybe even her whole life. "So, my dear daughter-in-law," she insisted, her voice echoing in the silence of the room, "what are you waiting for? Come and serve me like the good little slave you are." I felt my cheeks flush with shame and anger. How dare she? How could she try to humiliate me like that on my wedding day? I looked around for Nicolas. He was frozen in place, his face pale, visibly shocked by his mother's words. Our eyes met and I could see the confusion and pain in his gaze. Sophie, my faithful friend, took a step forward as if to intervene, but I stopped her with a gesture. This was my battle, I had to face it alone. "Madame Leclerc," I began, trying to keep my voice calm despite the trembling of my hands, "I think you may have had too much to drink." "Why don't you?" "Drank too much," she cut me off with a bitter laugh. "Oh no, my dear. I'm perfectly lucid. It's you who are blind. Blind to the way you've manipulated my son, blind to your own mediocrity." His words were like stabs. I felt tears welling up in my eyes, but I forced myself to hold them back. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me cry. "Mom, that's enough." Nicolas's voice rang out, loud and clear. He stepped forward, placing himself between his mother and me. "You have crossed the line. I demand that you apologize to Amélie immediately." Madame Leclerc looked at her son with a mixture of surprise and contempt. "Apologize? To her? Never. She's the one who should apologize for ruining your life." Murmurs began to rise among the guests. I saw looks of pity, shock, and even a few of sick amusement. This scene was becoming the main spectacle of our wedding, eclipsing everything else. "Please," I said, trying to keep my composure, "perhaps we could discuss this in private. This is neither the time nor the place for—" "Oh, but it's exactly the right time," cried Madame Leclerc, her voice rising an octave. "Let everyone see who you really are. A pushy, manipulative woman who seduced my son for his money and status." I felt anger welling up inside me. All those years of disparaging remarks, little digs, forced smiles, it was all exploding now, here, in front of all our loved ones. "I never—" I began, but she cut me off again. "Shut up. If you really want to be part of this family, prove it. Serve me like a slave, show everyone that you'll do anything to stay with my son." The silence that followed was deafening. I looked around, seeing the shocked faces of our guests, the pain on Nicolas' face, the fury in Sophie's eyes. And then, something inside me broke. Or perhaps it grew stronger. I couldn't say. But I knew at that moment that I could no longer remain silent. No, I said, my voice stronger and more assured than I would have thought possible. No, I won't serve you like a slave. I won't humiliate myself to please you. Madame Leclerc seemed momentarily taken aback by my response. She probably expected me to give in, to bend to her will as I had done so many times in the past to keep the peace. How dare you speak to me like that, she hissed. I'm your mother-in-law, you owe me respect. Respect is earned, Madame Leclerc, I replied, feeling a new strength come over me. And you've done nothing to deserve mine. From the day I met Nicholas, you've never stopped putting me down, criticizing me, making me feel I wasn't good enough for your son. I took a step forward, stepping closer to her. But you know what? I'm good enough. I'm more than that. I love your son with all my heart, and he loves me back. And none of your machinations will change that. The guests began to murmur again, but this time I felt the atmosphere had changed. There was approval in some eyes, support in others. Madame Leclerc, on the other hand, seemed to have lost her superbness. Her face had turned red with anger, or perhaps shame. You can't talk to me like that, she stammered. Yes, I can, I replied calmly. And I do. Because it's over, Madame Leclerc. Gone are the days when I kept quiet to preserve the peace. Gone are the days when I accepted your insults and humiliations. I felt Nicholas' hand slip into mine. He was by my side, silently supporting me. It gave me even more courage. This marriage isn't over, I continued. It's just beginning. And if you can't accept that, if you can't treat me with the respect I deserve, then maybe you should leave. A stony silence fell over the room. All eyes were riveted on Madame Leclerc, waiting for her reaction. For a long moment, she just stood there, speechless, unable to speak. Then, suddenly, she burst into tears. Big, loud sobs that shook her whole body. My son, she wailed, how can you let me do this? How can you choose her over me? Nicholas took a deep breath. I could feel how difficult this moment was for him. Mom, he said softly, I'm not choosing Amélie over you. I'm choosing my wife, my life partner. And I'd like you to be part of our lives, but not like this. Not by trying to separate us, not by insulting the woman I love. Madame Leclerc's tears redoubled. She looked around, as if seeking support among the guests. But all she found were disapproving or embarrassed glances. Finally, she turned on her heel and hurried out of the room, leaving a deafening silence behind her. I felt my legs weaken beneath me. The adrenaline that had carried me so far was beginning to fade. Nicholas hugged me, whispering words of comfort in my ear. Slowly, the music resumed. Guests began to move and talk, as if emerging from a trance. Sophie approached us, tears in her eyes. I'm so proud of you, Amélie, she said, hugging me. As the party slowly resumed, I couldn't help thinking about what had just happened. I had stood up to my mother-in-law, defended my love and my dignity. But at what cost? What would happen next? I didn't know it yet, but this confrontation would mark a turning point in Nicholas and my lives. A turning point that would lead us down paths we'd never imagined. At that moment, I realized I had two options: give in to the blackmail and humiliate myself, or face up to the situation. I looked at my husband, who seemed as shocked as I was. I took a deep breath and made a decision that would change the course of the evening. Time seemed to stand still. All eyes were on me, waiting for my reaction. I could feel the weight of their gazes, hear the deafening silence that had invaded the room. My heart was beating so fast I felt as if everyone could hear it. I looked at Nicholas, my husband of only a few hours. His face was pale, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. I could see he was torn between his love for me and his filial duty to his mother. This realization hurt, but it also gave me the strength I needed. I took a deep breath, feeling the air fill my lungs. It was as if I were breathing for the first time since Madame Leclerc had issued her ultimatum. I felt a strange clarity come over me, as if everything were suddenly crystal clear. No, I said, my voice stronger and more assured than I would have thought possible. No, I'm not going to humiliate myself to please you, Madame Leclerc. A murmur ran through the assembly. I could see surprise on the faces of some guests, approval on others. Madame Leclerc, for her part, seemed stunned by my answer. "How dare you?" she began, but I cut her off. "No, how dare you?" I retorted, feeling a wave of anger rise within me. "How dare you try to ruin the happiest day of our lives? How dare you ask me to humiliate myself in front of our friends and family?" I took a step forward, stepping closer to her. "Ever since I met Nicholas, you've never stopped putting me down, criticizing me, making me feel I wasn't good enough for him. But you know what? I've had enough." I felt Nicholas' hand slip into mine. He was by my side, silently supporting me. It gave me even more courage. "I'm here today because I love your son," I continued, "and because he loves me. We have chosen to spend our lives together, to build our future together. And if you can't accept that, if you can't treat me with the respect I deserve as your son's wife, then that's your problem, not ours." The silence that followed was palpable. I could see a succession of emotions on Madame Leclerc's face: anger, surprise, and finally, a kind of defeat. "You don't understand," she finally said, her voice trembling. "Nicholas is all I have. I can't lose him." "You're not losing him," I replied, softening my voice a little. "He'll always be your son. But he's also my husband now. And we have to find a way to coexist, to respect each other." Nicholas finally spoke up. "Mom," he said softly, "I love you. You know I do. But I also love Omelie. She's my wife now, my partner. I'm not choosing one over the other. I want you both in my life." I saw the tears welling up in Madame Leclerc's eyes. For the first time, I saw beyond her tough, critical facade. I saw a frightened woman, afraid of losing her son, afraid of change. I don't know how to do this," she confessed, her voice little more than a whisper. "We can start by trying," I offered, reaching out a hand toward her. "We can get to know each other, understand each other. We can try to be a family." For a long moment, Madame Leclerc looked at my outstretched hand. The assembly held its breath, waiting to see what would happen. Finally, slowly, she raised her hand and placed it in mine. "I'm sorry," she said, tears running freely down her cheeks. "I didn't mean to. I don't know what came over me." I squeezed her hand in mine, feeling a complex mix of emotions: relief, compassion, even a hint of hope. "It's a new beginning," I said. "For all of us." Nicholas wrapped us both in an embrace. I felt his tears wet my shoulder, and realized I was crying too. It was as if a long-suppressed tension had finally been released. Slowly, the music resumed. Guests began to move, to talk, as if emerging from a trance. Sophie approached us, her eyes shining with pride. "I'm so proud of you, Omelie," she whispered as she hugged me. As the party slowly resumed, I couldn't help but reflect on what had just happened. I had faced my greatest fear, my mother-in-law's disapproval, and emerged stronger. I had defended my love, my dignity, and perhaps even opened the door to a new understanding between us. It wasn't the end, of course. I knew we'd still have challenges to face, obstacles to overcome. The years of resentment and mistrust would not disappear overnight. But for the first time, I felt we had a real chance of building something positive. Nicholas pulled me aside a moment later. "I'm so sorry about all this," he said, guilt evident in his voice. "I never imagined my mother would go this far." "It's not your fault," I replied, gently caressing her cheek. "And maybe it was necessary. Maybe we needed this confrontation in order to move forward." He nodded, a small smile appearing on his face. "You were incredible," he said. "I couldn't have dreamed of a stronger, braver woman." Her words warmed my heart. Despite everything that had happened, despite the drama and the tears, I knew I had made the right choice. I had chosen love, dignity, and the hope of a better future. As the night wore on, I danced with Nicholas, laughed with our friends, and even shared a moment of complicity with my mother-in-law. It wasn't the perfect wedding I'd imagined, but it was ours. And in some ways, it was even more meaningful because of the hardships we'd been through. As I looked around me, seeing the smiling faces of our loved ones, feeling Nicholas' love, I realized that this decision, this moment of courage, had changed so much more than the course of that evening. It had changed the course of our lives. And as we prepared to cut the cake, hand in hand, I knew that whatever the future held, we'd be ready to face it. Together. Calmly, I approached Madame Leclerc. Instead of serving her, I took the microphone and revealed to all present the years of manipulation and emotional abuse she had inflicted on me and her own son. I exposed how she had repeatedly tried to sabotage our relationship and how this absurd demand was just the tip of the iceberg. The silence in the room was deafening. All eyes were on me, some wide with surprise, others crinkled in disbelief. I could feel the weight of each gaze, but I didn't waver. This was the moment of truth, the moment to release everything I'd held inside for so long. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, my voice trembling but determined. I'm sorry to interrupt our celebration in this way. But there are things that need to be said, truths that need to be revealed. I took a deep breath, searching Nicholas with my gaze. He stared at me, wide-eyed, but I saw in his gaze a mixture of fear and support. That gave me the strength to carry on. From the day I met Nicholas, his mother, Madame Leclerc, kept trying to separate us. At first, it was subtle. Disparaging remarks about my origins, my ambitions, my appearance. Comments that seemed innocent but were designed to make me doubt myself, to make me feel I wasn't good enough for her son. I saw Ms. Leclerc try to protest, but I cut her off with a gesture. Over time, her tactics became more aggressive. She started spreading rumors about me to Nicholas' family and friends. She tried to make me out to be an upstart, a manipulator who was only interested in her son's money and social status. Murmurs began to rise in the room. I saw some guests exchanging glances, as if they were beginning to understand certain things. But that wasn't all, I continued. She also manipulated her own son. She played on his guilt, on his sense of filial duty. She pretended to be sick to keep him from spending time with me. She even tried to convince him I was unfaithful, going so far as to hire someone to follow me around and take compromising photos, which turned out to be montages. I heard gasps of surprise from the assembly. Nicholas had lowered his head, his fists clenched. I knew it was hard for him to hear all this, but I also knew it was necessary. Despite all this, Nicholas and I persisted. Our love was stronger than her machinations. We overcame every obstacle she put in our way. And today, we got married. We made the choice to spend our lives together, to build our future together. I paused, letting my words echo around the room. And yet, even today, the day that should be the happiest of our lives, Madame Leclerc couldn't resist trying to separate us one last time. Her ultimatum, serve me like a slave or end the marriage, is just the latest in a long series of attempts to belittle me, to make me feel I'm not worthy of her son. I looked directly at Madame Leclerc. She was pale, her eyes wide with horror as her actions were exposed for all to see. But you know what? I've had enough. I'm tired of keeping quiet, of trying to preserve the peace at the expense of my own dignity. I'm tired of seeing the man I love torn between his love for me and his duty to a mother who doesn't respect his choices. I felt Nicholas' hand slip into mine. He was by my side, silently supporting me. It gave me even more courage. I'm here today because I love Nicholas with all my heart. I'm here because we've chosen to build a life together, despite all the obstacles. And I won't let anyone, not even his mother, come between us again. I took a deep breath, feeling tears welling up in my eyes. I'm sorry to have to do this today, in front of all of you. But it was time for the truth to be told. It was time we put an end to this cycle of abuse and manipulation. I extended my hand to Nicholas, who took it without hesitation. Nicholas and I are a team. We're partners in life, in love, in everything. And if someone can't accept that, if they can't respect both of us, then that person has no place in our lives. The silence that followed was deafening. For a long time, no one moved, no one spoke. It was as if time had stood still. Then, slowly, someone started clapping. It was Sophie, my maid of honor and best friend. Others joined in, and soon the whole room was ringing with applause. I saw tears in the eyes of some guests. Others nodded approvingly. Even those who seemed shocked by my revelations had a gleam of understanding in their eyes. Madame Leclerc, for her part, was frozen in place. Her face was a mask of shock and disbelief. For the first time, I saw her as she really was, a frightened woman, afraid of losing her son, afraid of change. Nicholas finally spoke. "Mom," he said, his voice shaky but firm, "is it true? Did you really do all those things?" Madame Leclerc opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She looked around, as if searching for an escape, but found only accusing or disappointed glances. I didn't mean to," she finally stammered. "I thought I was doing what was best for you. By trying to separate myself from the woman I love," asked Nicholas, disbelief evident in his voice. "By manipulating and lying?" "I'm sorry," Madame Leclerc murmured, tears running freely down her cheeks. "I don't know what else to say." I felt a wave of compassion wash over me, despite all she'd put us through. "Maybe it's not too late," I said softly. "We can still try to rebuild, to create a healthy relationship. But it has to start with mutual respect and honesty." Nicholas nodded, squeezing my hand in his. "We're willing to try if you are, Mom. But things have got to change. We will no longer tolerate this kind of behavior." Madame Leclerc looked at us both, then slowly nodded. I'll try," she promised in a faint voice. As silence fell over the room, I realized that this moment had changed so much more than the course of that evening. It had changed the course of our lives. We'd faced the truth, had it out in the open, and now had the chance to rebuild on a healthier foundation. It wasn't the ending I'd imagined for our marriage, but in a way, it was a new beginning. A beginning filled with honesty, courage, and hope for the future. What followed was a mixed bag of reactions. Some guests were shocked, others applauded my courage. My husband, for the first time, confronted his mother publicly, supporting me and asking her to leave the party. It was a liberating moment for both of us. The silence that had followed my speech was suddenly broken by a hubbub of voices. The reception hall, previously frozen in stunned silence, suddenly exploded into a cacophony of exclamations, murmurs, and animated discussion. I stood there, microphone still in hand, heart pounding. The adrenaline that had carried me through my speech was starting to subside, and I could feel my legs trembling slightly. Nicholas was at my side, his hand firmly clasped in mine, his face a mixture of pride and apprehension. Madame Leclerc, for her part, seemed to have shrunk on the spot. Her face, usually so composed, was a mask of shock and disbelief. She looked around, as if searching for an ally, someone to defend her, but found only accusing or disappointed glances. Suddenly, Nicholas' voice rose, loud and clear, dominating the hubbub of the room. "Mom," he said, his voice trembling slightly but imbued with a determination I'd never heard from him before, "I think it's time for you to go." A collective gasp went through the assembly. Madame Leclerc looked at her son, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Nicholas," she stammered, "you can't be serious." "I'm your mother." "Yes, you are my mother," Nicholas replied, his voice firming. "And I love you. But what you've done, what you keep doing, it's not love, Mom. It's manipulation, it's toxic, and I can't take it anymore." I felt my heart swell with pride and love for my husband. I knew how difficult this confrontation must be for him, but he was holding firm, supporting me. But, Madame Leclerc searched for words, her gaze shifting frantically from Nicholas to me, then to the guests around her. "You don't understand. Everything I did was to protect my son." "Protect me from what, Mom?" asked Nicholas, his voice tinged with sadness and frustration. "From love. Happiness. Of a woman who loves me for what I am, not for what you'd like me to be." These words seemed to strike Madame Leclerc like a physical blow. She staggered slightly, clutching at a nearby chair to steady herself. I didn't mean to," she began, but Nicholas interrupted her. "It doesn't matter what you wanted, Mom. What matters is what you did. You've tried to sabotage my relationship with Amelie from the start. You've lied, manipulated, spread rumors. And even today, on our wedding day, you couldn't help trying to separate us one last time." I saw tears shining in Nicholas' eyes, but his voice remained firm. "I love you, Mom. You will always be my mother. But I can no longer allow your toxic behavior to poison our happiness. So please, I'm asking you to leave. Now." A stony silence fell over the room. All eyes were riveted on Madame Leclerc, awaiting her reaction. For a long moment, she remained motionless, as if petrified by her son's words. Then, slowly, almost mechanically, she straightened up. Her face was a mask of pain and defeat. Without a word, she headed for the exit, the guests parting in her wake like the Red Sea before Moses. Just before the door, she stopped and turned around. Her gaze met mine, and for the first time, I saw neither contempt nor hostility. Just deep sadness and, perhaps, a glimmer of regret. Then she disappeared, leaving behind a deafening silence. I turned to Nicholas, worried about his reaction. His face was pale, his eyes bright with suppressed tears. Without a word, I embraced him, holding him tightly against me. "I'm so sorry," I whispered. "I know how hard it must have been for you." He returned my embrace, burying his face in my neck. "Don't be," he replied softly. "You didn't do anything wrong. You had to. For too long, I'd let my mother dictate my life, our lives. It was time for that to change." We held each other for what seemed like an eternity, drawing strength and comfort from each other. All around us, the guests began to move, talking in hushed tones, as if unsure how to react to what had just happened. Finally, Sophie, my maid of honor and best friend, approached us. She placed a hand on my shoulder, offering us an encouraging smile. "You were incredible, both of you," she said softly. "I know it wasn't easy, but you did what you had to do." His words seemed to break the spell that kept the room in a state of shock. Gradually, other guests approached, offering their support and understanding. "We're sorry you had to go through that," said Nicholas's uncle, a man with a kind face. "But we're proud of you. You showed great courage." "It was the right thing to do," added my cousin Elise. "You deserve to be happy, without having to constantly look over your shoulder." Gradually, the atmosphere in the room began to change. The tension that had prevailed after Madame Leclerc's departure gradually dissipated, replaced by a feeling of solidarity and support. Nicholas straightened up, discreetly wiping his eyes. He looked around, seemingly surprised by the support we were receiving. "Thank you," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "Thank you all for your understanding and support. It means a lot to us." I clasped his hand in mine, feeling a wave of love and gratitude wash over me. Despite the drama that had just unfolded, I felt lighter, as if a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders. "And now," I said, a small smile on my lips, "how about we resume this celebration? After all, it's still our wedding, isn't it?" A murmur of approval ran through the assembly. Slowly, the music resumed, softly at first, then louder and louder. The guests began to relax, to smile, to dance. Nicholas looked at me, a mixture of pain and hope in his eyes. "Are you sure?" he asked softly. "After everything that's just happened?" I placed my hand on his cheek, looking him straight in the eye. "I've never been so sure of anything," I replied. "What just happened was difficult, yes. But it was necessary. And now we can truly begin our life together, without shadows, without secrets." He nodded, a small smile appearing on his face. "You're right," he said. "As always." Hand in hand, we made our way to the dance floor. As we began to dance, I felt something change in me, in us. We'd faced adversity together, we'd weathered the storm. And we'd emerged stronger, more united than ever. It may not have been the perfect marriage I'd imagined, but it was ours. And in some ways, it was even more meaningful because of the hardships we'd been through. As we twirled on the dance floor, surrounded by the love and support of our loved ones, I knew that whatever the future held, we'd be ready to face it. Together. That night, which should have been all about love and togetherness, turned out to be a turning point in our lives. We learned the importance of setting boundaries, even with family. The marriage continued, stronger than ever, and we began our life together with a new perspective on family relationships and self-esteem. The wedding party was back on track, but the atmosphere had changed. There was a new energy in the air, a mixture of relief, excitement, and anticipation. Nicholas and I were dancing in the center of the dance floor, surrounded by our friends and family, all those who had supported us through this unexpected ordeal. As we twirled around the dance floor, I couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. What had started out as a dream day had turned into a real nightmare, eventually becoming something far more profound and significant than we could have imagined. "What are you thinking?" whispered Nicholas in my ear, bringing me back to the present. I looked up at him, seeing a mixture of tenderness and concern in his gaze. "I'm thinking about us," I replied softly. "About everything that's happened today, everything it means for our future." He nodded, understanding completely. "It's been quite a day, hasn't it?" I couldn't help but laugh softly, to say the least. We continued to dance in silence for a while, each lost in his own thoughts. Then Nicholas spoke again. "You know," he said, his voice barely louder than a whisper, "I never thought I'd have the strength to face my mother like this. 4 years, I let her manipulations and control dictate my life. But today, thanks to you, I've finally found the courage to say no." I felt my heart swell with love and pride for this wonderful man. "You've always had this strength in you, Nicholas," I replied. "You just needed the right reason to let it out." He held me a little tighter against him. "And that reason is you," he said simply. We continued to dance, savoring this moment of peace and intimacy in the midst of the party. All around us, our guests were laughing, dancing, enjoying the evening. But for us, it was as if the outside world had ceased to exist. It was just the two of us, united not only by our love, but also by the ordeal we'd just been through together. Later that evening, as we took a break to refresh ourselves, Sophie joined us. She had bright eyes and a big smile on her face. "You too," she said, taking us each by one arm, "you're incredible. I've never seen a couple so strong, so united." I felt my cheeks flush under the compliment. "Thank you, Sophie," I replied. "We couldn't have gotten through all this without your support." She swept away my thanks with a wave of her hand. "That's what friends are for. But seriously, what you did today, it was brave. And necessary." Nicholas nodded, his face suddenly serious. "It wasn't easy," he admitted. "But you're right, it was necessary. For too long, I've let my mother dictate the terms of my life, our life. It was time for that to change." "And now?" asked Sophie, looking at us in turn. I took a deep breath, exchanging a glance with Nicholas. "Now," I said slowly, "we begin our life together. Without interference, without manipulation. Just the two of us, building our future as we see fit." Nicholas squeezed my hand in his. "Exactly," he confirmed. "We learned an important lesson today. The importance of setting boundaries, even with family. The importance of standing up for what you believe in, for those you love." Sophie looked at us with a mixture of pride and affection. "You'll make it," she said with conviction. "You're stronger together than you've ever been apart." His words resonated with me, reminding me of everything Nicholas and I had gone through to get to this point. The obstacles we'd overcome, the challenges we'd met. And now here we were, married, united not only by love but also by a deeper mutual understanding than ever before. The rest of the evening passed as in a dream. We danced, laughed, talked with our guests. Every moment seemed more precious, more meaningful after what had happened. It was as if we were seeing everything in a new light, with a new appreciation for the life we had chosen together. As the night drew to a close and the last guests began to leave, Nicholas and I found ourselves alone on the dance floor. The music was soft, the lights subdued. We danced slowly, our bodies pressed together, savoring these last moments of our wedding day. "You know," Nicholas murmured, "when I imagined our wedding, I never thought it would turn out like this." I looked up at him, seeing a small smile playing on his lips. "Me neither," I admitted. "But in a way, it was perfect." He raised an eyebrow, surprised. "Perfect? Even with all the drama?" I nodded, sure of myself. "Yes, even with this. Because it gave us a solid start to our marriage. We faced adversity together, we stood our ground against the storm. And we came out stronger." Nicholas pondered my words for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You're right," he said. "It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Now we know we can face anything together." "Exactly," I confirmed. "And it's a solid foundation on which to build our future." We continued to dance in silence, savoring each other's presence. I thought about everything we'd been through, everything the future held in store for us. I knew it wouldn't always be easy. There would be challenges to face, obstacles to overcome. But I also knew that we were ready to face them, together. That night, as we finally left the reception hall, hand in hand, I felt filled with a sense of peace and anticipation. We had weathered the storm, we had stood firm in the face of adversity. And now we were ready to begin our new life together. Our marriage may not have been the perfect fairy tale I'd imagined. But it had been real, honest, and deeply meaningful. We had learned important lessons about love, family, and the importance of staying true to ourselves and our values. As we climbed into the car that would take us to our honeymoon, I took one last look at the reception hall. This night would always be engraved in my memory, not as the day when everything had almost gone wrong, but as the day when Nicholas and I had truly begun our life together, stronger and more united than ever. And as we drove off into the night, I knew with absolute certainty that whatever the future held, we'd be ready to face it. Together, as husband and wife, as partners in life.